We have a full panel, and I want to get started. Can everyone hear? I've noticed yesterday that sometimes it was quite hard to hear both speakers and questions, so please project. Okay, good. I'm not usually complimented for being loud enough, but I'm trying. So it's a pleasure to begin day 2 of our conference on Thinking with Bourdieu with our panel on literary theory and Bourdieusian critical approaches. As a co-organizer of the conference, I want to mention on a personal note what a pleasure it was to work with other members of our group, Gisèle Sapiro from UHESS, who gave us our keynote last night, Camille Robsis and Tom Dodman from Columbia, Stefanos Geroulanos from the Remarque Institute in the History Department, and last but not least, Frédéric Viguier, the director of IFS. And I should note that we began our collaboration on Bourdieu with a conference at NYU in Paris last June. And it was called, so part 1 was called Transatlantic Reflections on Bourdieu's Legacy. And there were papers by a number of us, including Hannah Friis-Ball, who is in the audience. So welcome, everyone. So our panel is really a wonderful panel, and I'm going to keep introductions relatively short. I think I will introduce everybody all at once so that we can have a quick transition paper to paper. I'm honored to introduce my colleague in the English department, Julia Silver Professor John Guillory. One of the great readers and conceptual translators of Bourdieu's work, John helped introduce the world of Eng-Lit and the Anglophone humanities more generally to questions of how a literary field emerges at the locus of institutional authority and pedagogy. His 1993 landmark book, Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation, which I ascertained was never translated into French, galvanized U.S. literary criticism and theory, leaving its mark on the sociology of literature and the writing of literary history. His long 1997 essay, Bourdieu's Refusal, published in Modern Language Quarterly, begins by interrogating causes of Bourdieu's belated reception in the U.S. Academy and reviews Loïc Vacan's observation that, quote, the reception of any foreign oeuvre is mediated by structures of the national intellectual field. Since field is one of the concepts we're interrogating here, I thought that was worth mentioning. His 2022 book, Professing Criticism, Essays on the Organization of Literary Study, which characterizes the culture wars playing out from the 80s to the present as domestic forever wars, takes a bracing look at how academic criticism, especially high theory, justifies its stakes and negotiates its public at a time when many readers resist the critical demands of close reading. And in fact, close reading is the topic of a book forthcoming with Chicago, alongside another called Freedom of Thought, Philosophy and Literature in the Munich Renaissance. His talk today is titled Degrees of Separation, Some Notes on Social Capital. I think I will do the introductions person by person because I feel like that's just a perfect way to introduce you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. So please tell me if I'm not projecting to the far reachers. Am I? Does that mean a yes or a no? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. The reception of Bourdieu's work in the US continues to be less extensive than it should be, and will remain so, in my view, for as long as the categories of class and class struggle resist fuller integration into what Loïc Vacan calls the national intellectual field. Although many scholars in the humanities have attempted of late to bring the concept of capitalism into the foreground of social theory, this concept has been amended in much current discourse to the term racial capitalism. The modifier eases the circulation of the term by projecting capitalism as a universal system of exploitation and oppression. The capital-labor relation is not immediately at stake in this usage, though not excluded from the conceptualization of systemic ills. The problem of how to integrate the specifically economic relation into cultural theory is, of course, much larger than American versions of Western Marxism. Bourdieu developed his own solution to this problem in part by relegating the economy to a dimensionless center of force in the modern world. If this force is determinative, in a sense analogous to Althusser's determination in the last instance, it also opens class struggle to the cultural field, where the economic is transformed into relations characterized sometimes by a denial of the economic, as in the realms of art and science, the domains of cultural capital. These denials do not actually negate the economic, but transmute its force into relations of exchange governed by other principles than the exchange of commodities, including that commodity which is human labor. In the pre-modern world, for Bourdieu, these other principles of exchange pervade the whole of social life. A different form of capital than the economic, what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital, is given the dominant role. In these other times and places, exchange can take the non-capitalist form, most prominently of an exchange of gifts rather than commodities. The form of wealth accumulated by this means is not money, but honor, the kind of esteem that nonetheless, like money, can command the labor of others. This form of capital can be institutionalized in a caste-like system in which titles of nobility are inherited along with land. In Bourdieu's essay, Forms of Capital, symbolic capital in the modern world reappears in two distinct forms, cultural and social. These two forms of capital are often institutionalized, but they do not require a category of nobility or legally fixed status hierarchy. Two schema, then, are necessary for Bourdieu to grasp in all its forms the relation of the economic to other domains of the social. The first schema, specific to pre-modern societies, is binary, economic capital and symbolic capital. A version of symbolic capital is carried over into the modern world, but the binary scheme is replaced by a trinary one, economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital. The word symbolic does not appear in this threefold schema, which conveys Bourdieu's conception of the world capitalism has created. And yet it would not be correct to say that in the trinary schema, symbolic capital has been simply subdivided into the categories of the cultural and the social. Crossing the historical threshold into the modern capitalist world alters the character of the symbolic itself. The category of the economic is transformed too in the modern world, but here the transformation is a result of recognizing the economic as such. If the word symbolic disappears in the trinary schema, the modern capitalist world discloses the operation of the economic in its predecessor, as though for the first time, as though it had not existed before. This discovery amounts, in a sense, to the invention of the economic. I have argued in earlier work that Bourdieu's interest in the complexities of the economy as such, money, credit, debt, banks, financial interests, is minimal, at the same time that he imputes an ultimate force of determination to the economic in all social systems, both modern and pre-modern. This determinative force can be grasped as the universality of exchange in human relations. In Outline of a Theory of Practice, he posits a conception of exchange that precedes the fundamental relation of the capitalist economy, commodity exchange, which he sees as a special case of the economic, a subset of a general economy of exchange. I'm not interested today in affirming or disputing this foundational move of Bourdieu's. I'm rather concerned with a possible tension between his two schemas, the binary and trinary, insofar as these schemas define a succession of historical eras. Specifically, I'm interested in looking closely at the category of social capital, about which Bourdieu seems to have rather less to say than cultural capital, the focus of his work that has had greatest impact in the Anglo-American world. I want first to note that, given the huge importance of symbolic capital to Bourdieu's earlier work in Algeria, the relatively lesser attention given to social capital in his work on French culture is interesting, perhaps even striking. Social capital is a version of capital that is closer in some respects to the symbolic domain, in that it is more difficult to quantify as a form of wealth than cultural capital. If in the pre-modern world, symbolic capital takes the form of honor, I will assume, following Bourdieu, that social capital in the modern world takes the form of recognition. Those who possess social capital are those who are known. Here is Bourdieu's definition spelled out, and this is from Forms of Capital. Social capital is the sum of the resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to an individual or a group by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance or recognition. Let me note before proceeding further that Bourdieu orients his definition very differently from Anglo-American sociology, which tends to regard social capital as the result of the mutual trust experienced by members of voluntary associations. Social capital in American sociology is a desirable quantum, and much social capital theory is concerned with how to increase a group's measure of such capital, benefiting all members of the group. Bourdieu's concept is much more oriented toward the sociology of everyday life, which is more sensitive to the fact of inequality in access to resources. There, social capital is evoked by the familiar saying, "It's not what you know, it's who you know." What you know is perhaps the most compact definition possible of cultural capital. Who you know is, by comparison, more mysterious. It's not at all obvious how one person comes to know another person, or what knowing means in this context. And this is the problem I would like to address. In order to make some progress toward an understanding of social capital, I will offer here an example, which will also bring the concept of social capital into relation to literature. I will suggest that social capital is at the basis of a narrative scenario that is ubiquitous in works of Western literature, but especially in the realist novel. Now, there's nothing at all surprising about this observation, and yet it is resistant to analysis for a reason that will bring the issue of class back into view. In the meantime, we can glance at my exemplary text, my example, drawn from a hyper-canonical American novel, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. And I hope I can depend in what follows on the extreme familiarity of this novel, probably tedious familiarity of it, to nearly everyone, certainly everyone in the US. In this passage, the first-person narrator, Nick Carraway, pauses his story to list some of the many guests who attend Gatsby's notorious parties, which have passed into our immemorial culture as emblematic of the Jazz Age. So I'm only reading a small portion of a long passage which runs to over 2 pages in the novel. So I read the first paragraph and then skip over the second paragraph, and then it goes on and on and on after that. From East Egg then came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Black Buck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped their noses like goats at whosoever came near. And the Ismays and the Christies, or rather Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. And then he goes on to the Endives, the Cheadles, the Schraders, the Abrams, the Snells, the Ulysses Sweats, the Danceys, the Whitebaits, Flinks, Hammerheads, and Belugas. And I spare you the descriptions. You can check them out on the board behind me. Nick Carraway goes on to list 50 more names with brief descriptions and brings the whole list to a conclusion with the sentence, "All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer." The last sentence keys us into the fact that we've been reading a kind of Homeric catalog, and that we might add epic to the generic mashup of Fitzgerald's novel: comedy, tragedy, satire, farce, elegy, epic. It's a story, after all, about greatness, Gatsby's efforts to achieve a kind of nobility, to become the great Gatsby. The names in Nick Carraway's list are fictitious, though some of them sound like they might belong to real people. Others are obviously jokes. Gatsby's parties invoke the Roaring Twenties for today's readers. Gatsby also makes a sustained allusion to Petronius's prose narrative Satyricon, the section known as Trimalchio's Dinner, relating a feast given by a nouveau riche Roman citizen. Fitzgerald had originally contemplated naming his book Trimalchio's Dinner, and the name comes up later. The allusion permits Fitzgerald to crash the great dinner party of the Western canon, a very successful gambit in this case, as there are only a few American novels more canonical than this one. In fact, The Great Gatsby was poorly received when it was published and only slowly gained its current status. And I'm going to try to say a little something about the canonicity of the novel in the context of social capital by the end of my paper. The crowd at Gatsby's parties are a mix of old money and new money, older and younger people, married and single, but all presumably wealthy. What distinguishes them in Nick Carraway's narrative is the fact that he knows them by sight and by name. He is one of their tribe, even if he is not intimate with them. And this familiarity is, of course, reinforced by a class and ethnic habitus. How did he come to know them? The answer to this question defines his social capital. Like the man named Bunsen, Nick went to Yale, and he comes from a family, he tells us, of prominent, well-to-do people from the Midwest. West and East are thematized in the novel, West Egg and East Egg. West Egg is old money, East Egg is new money, farther out on the island. To go east is to climb up the social ladder, and that's the kind of narrative trajectory in the novel. Nick is a lowly bond trader at the bottom of a financial hierarchy without a fortune, and yet he knows these people with whom he possibly has business relations. He can approach them socially, and they can do favors for him, perhaps buy the bonds he wants to sell. By contrast to Nick, Gatsby has immense wealth, acquired most likely by criminal means. His unknown origins and dubious fortune are an impediment to the acquisition of social capital, which he awkwardly attempts to purchase through his famous parties. But the people who are known, who are recognized, circulate through Gatsby's parties without coming to know Gatsby himself. The parties fail to achieve the purpose for which such parties are usually organized, bringing the known into contact with each other, or bringing someone who seeks to be known by the known into the scene of mutual recognition. To borrow a term of Bourdieu's, Gatsby's failure can be described as a failure of transubstantiation. All right, the conversion of one kind of capital to another. Bourdieu uses this word in forms of capital, but he does not elaborate on the allusion to the Eucharist. From my perspective, the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ is a useful analog for the conversion of one kind of capital into another. Such conversions require belief, and they entail the possibility of failure. As we know, the Protestants rejected the Eucharist as just a metaphor, just as some scholars have rejected Bourdieu's notions of cultural and social capital as just metaphors. Sometimes, though, a mere metaphor makes something happen in the real world. To say otherwise seems to me to deny the reality of social relations, to reduce these relations to what Bourdieu calls social physics, dominated presumably by the uninteresting, naked self-interest of economic rationality. It is foolish to deny that the wheels of commerce are greased in the unofficial scenes of social capital, the thousand scenarios of introduction, first impressions, handshakes, and shared recollections of acquaintances in common. For the present, I would like to remain with the question of knowing or recognition as a signature of social capital. To be known is to possess social capital. Those who wish to possess capital of the same sort can come to possess it by becoming known to the known. The transmission of such capital is limited to what can be transmitted from one individual to another. In this limitation, social capital is not like cultural capital, which can be transmitted in the form of knowledge to large numbers, as in the school. The knowing that defines social capital is not knowledge of that sort, but recognition, connaissance. This kind of knowing assumes a certain distance between the persons who come to know each other, a distance that can be stretched only so far. The way in which Nick Carraway knows the names of guests at Gatsby's parties measures the maximum distance between Nick and those who are known, that is, those who possess a measure of social capital. The degrees of separation between Nick and these people can only be bridged by an introduction, by mutual acquaintance. This is the way in which social capital is transmitted, by mediations that ordinarily have a limit to 1 or 2 degrees of separation. Such introductions can work for a friend of a friend, but not usually for a friend of a friend. The relations that mediate social capital might be comprehended within the framework of a theory of weak ties, or by some version of network theory, but I will defer considerations of these framings for another occasion in order to emphasize what strikes me as most important about the way in which social capital is disclosed in Gatsby's parties. As a fact of class, social capital shares the potential of capital itself to establish non-local relations, relations that transcend the bounds established by institutions of time and place. And it's no surprise that the class struggle permeates every social space in Fitzgerald's novel. The narrative strains and groans with the burden of representing this struggle, so conspicuously foregrounded in Tom Buchanan's relation to his working class mistress, Myrtle Wilson, and literalized horrifically when Daisy Buchanan runs over the same Myrtle in her expensive car. The rich are not like us, but who are we? The class relations Nick Carraway shares with the guests at Gatsby's parties make possible a sort of specious intimacy that can be related to Bourdieu's conception of habitus. The rich are like each other. But the acquisition of social capital requires something more than habitus. Nick knows Tom Buchanan not only because Tom is married to his distant cousin, with whom Nick is actually not intimate, but also because they knew each other slightly at Yale. The cultural capital they acquired at Yale, whatever that might be, is not the basis for their relationship. They went there for the connections. Only this kind of connection makes it possible for Nick to introduce Gatsby to the Buchanans, who are in most respects like the other guests at Gatsby's parties. The parties are in fact meant to function as a lure, a means of bringing Gatsby back into contact with the woman whom he loves and who once loved him, but who rejected him because he had neither the economic nor the social capital sufficient to establish a marital bond. As it happens, the parties fail as a lure in this sense. Gatsby and Daisy need to be reintroduced in person, a social ritual that only Nick Carraway can perform. Gatsby's parties capture not the Buchanans, but Nick Carraway, and that is enough to establish a connection. The Buchanans live across the bay in West Egg on an estate visible from Gatsby's palace, but which might have been located on the moon, so far as accessibility to Gatsby is concerned. In facilitating the reunion of Gatsby and Daisy, Nick initiates the narrative of the novel. This romance narrative, which fails in the end, is generically familiar and indeed ancient. It is nothing other than a belated iteration of chivalric romance. Gatsby approaches Daisy as her knight, ever faithful to his lady. His service in the military reinforces this association. The chivalric romance is offered as the plot of the novel, subordinating the scenario of social capital to its powerful fantasy. In this way, the novel attaches itself to the romance fantasies that drive so much Western literature. Nick Carraway is seduced by this story, which is manifestly false. The fantasy romance purveyed by Fitzgerald's novel might be contrasted in this respect with Proust's nearly contemporaneous great novel, which foregrounds the fact of social capital as the engine of its narrative. Romance is only a distraction, though a powerful one. The quest for social capital governs much of the plotting in the European realist novel, extending back to Stendhal's The Red and the Black and Balzac's Lost Illusions. Julien Sorel and Lucien de Rubempré understand that their romances with aristocratic women are only instrumental, a way to give their social climbing an initial lift. A similar narrative line can be found in Flaubert's Sentimental Education, the novel with which Bourdieu was so obsessed. It would be an impossible task here to demonstrate the difference in this context with the American novel or Anglo-American novel, the heroes of which are so often taken in by their great expectations. And here I would offer as a cautionary tale Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. Jude Fawley is just a craftsman of no social distinction, yet he dreams of entering Oxford University, of taking his place in the line of great scholars. He amasses cultural capital toward this end, teaching himself Greek and Latin, a heroic autodidactic feat. Unfortunately, Jude has no connections to anyone at the university, and this cultural capital never requires any value at all. It is useless currency without the aid of social capital. This is a bitter lesson for Jude, as also for Gatsby, who hopes to convert his economic capital into social capital. In the modern world, social capital acts as a catalyst in the process of transubstantiating one kind of capital into another. There is a delicate chemistry to this operation. It can easily fail. In any case, succeed or fail, social capital is embodied by an individual person. Only Nick Carraway can bring Daisy to Gatsby. All of the other guests at his party are useless to him. Gatsby's romance might have taken another course if the novel had been conceived as an actual iteration of chivalric romance. Then Gatsby's peasant origins would have been revealed as a disguise. Gatsby would recover his true identity as a person of high birth, like Spenser's Red Cross Knight in The Faerie Queene, who begins the poem as a peasant, but is unveiled in the end as the noble George, the knight who famously kills the dragon besieging Lady Una's city. In the world of capitalism, this narrative can only be a fantasy. Unlike Red Cross Knight, Gatsby's armor is just a set of expensive shirts bought for him by a man he knows in Europe. If he is morally superior to the true knight, the true aristocrat, Tom Buchanan, and it's necessary here that Buchanan is such a repellent character, a horrible racist and misogynist and everything else that's horrible, that is only an excuse for his being taken in by an aristocratic fantasy, a misreading of social capital. He is in the end more like Jude Fawley. He pretends to have gone to Oxford, and he would never have gone to Yale. He would never have gotten into Yale. Gatsby is at best a robber baron, that is, a robber who aspires unsuccessfully to be a baron. Along the path of his expectations, he attracts one believer in his greatness, his innate nobility, Nick Carraway, who says that Gatsby possesses an inexplicable quality he calls gorgeousness. I want to comment finally on this notion, which I believe can plausibly be transferred from Gatsby's person to the novel in which he appears. Ordinarily, we think of a novel such as The Great Gatsby as a monument of cultural capital. To know the novel is to possess knowledge in another sense, precisely the sense that distinguishes cultural capital from economic capital. The relation of this kind of knowledge to the knowing of social capital is more difficult to specify. In addition to the gorgeousness of its self-consciously literary language, The Great Gatsby is in the end a head-on collision with the fact of social capital. In this fact lies the novel's modernity. This is why it does not fall into the trap of so many Victorian novels, which are, as it is said, tragedies with happy endings. Great Gatsby's canonicity, best understood as the result of a lure, is best understood as the result of a lure. The romantic narrative is offered as a distraction in order for the author to engage the fact of social capital. This engagement prevents the novel from falling to the level of a throwaway, trashy romance. To conclude, sociology is only one perspective on the human world, and often rather a harsh perspective. That is certainly the burden of much commentary on Bourdieu. In this context, Fitzgerald's underplot of social capital adapts the harsh gaze of sociology, like the famous spectacles of the optometrist on the highway billboard. If it were possible, conversely, to direct the novel's gaze at sociology itself, I would say that the novel tells us that certain idealizations, certain fantasies are impossible to remove from social life. These idealizations draw a veil over the fact that we humans inevitably use each other, and that there is nothing inherently wrong with this. Another way to say this is that we do favors for each other. We introduce friends to friends, acquaintances to acquaintances. This distribution of social capital will never be equal. It will always temporarily ennoble some and deprive others of recognition. If the reductive version of this distribution of social capital were true everywhere and in all cases, if it were truly the case that it's not what you know, but who you know, then social life would everywhere and in all cases be given over to an irrationality that is the rationalist correlative of economic capital's tyranny. Against this narrative, one would like to preserve the possibility that social capital can sometimes take a more benign form, that knowing another person in those cases might be more like knowing a great novel, enjoying its gorgeousness without assuming too quickly its author's self-interested motives or expectations of greatness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We'll hold questions till the end. Our next speaker is Professor Sylvaine Guyot, my brilliant colleague in NYU's Department of French Literature and Culture. Sylvaine's work is focused on Racine, 17th century theater and spectacle culture, the history of the body and emotions, and the formation of cultural institutions in pre-1800 France. She's the co-leader of the Comédie Française Registers Project, a transatlantic research endeavor in digital archiving, and the author of journal articles on contemporary autofictional docu-plays that tell the stories of the underrepresented. Sylvaine has a forthcoming article titled Bourdieu, Lecteur de Pascal, and she and Bourdieu have been,
No.
she and Bourdieu.
No.
You're younger than you.
Have been co-teaching a graduate seminar this spring on Pierre Bourdieu's literary afterlives. In the context of that seminar, they brought in Edouard Louis as a visiting professor and coordinated a series of fantastic public exchanges with New Yorker writer Alexandra Schwartz, Garth Greenwell, and Hannah Friedthal. So her talk today is intriguingly titled, Literary Metabolization from Mapping to Molding the Field.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, so when the cover of the French magazine Paris Match revealed the romantic relationship between the 2018 Goncourt winner, Nicolas Mathieu, and Princess of Monaco, Charlotte Casiraghi, the crime fiction writer, Michel Ambarek, published the following comment on his Facebook page. Bourdieu himself would remain speechless. So it might sound like a frivolous anecdote, but it's not. Nicolas Mathieu is one of these trans-class writers, hailed as the legitimate heir of Pierre Bourdieu, who writes fiction books that question the persisting class divide in France. Bourdieu en resterait sans voix. This ironical image of an aphasic Bourdieu suggests that Mathieu's misalliance is a betrayal, both a disaffiliation with and a refutation of Bourdieu. The premise here is twofold: that being a Bourdieusian writer, a literary writer, requests full allegiance, corps et âme, and that Bourdieu's sociology supposedly sentences individuals to the iron cage of a rigid determinism. In taking up metabolization as a metaphor to analyze what Frédéric Viguier and I have called Bourdieu's literary afterlives, I want to move beyond that alternative of either faithfulness or betrayal in order to question not what Bourdieu did to literature, but rather what possibilities Bourdieu did open up for literature, and second, what literature does or maybe is doing to Bourdieu. Les enfants de Bourdieu, Bourdieu's children, have been fast proliferating in the literary field since Serge Danet coined the phrase les enfants de Bourdieu in 1991. The past 3 decades have witnessed a wave of autosociobiographies, the meteoric recognition of Édouard Louis, the Nobel Prize awarded to Annie Ernaux, a growing number of adaptations of these trans-class stories for stage and film, the critique and reappropriation of the genre of autosociobiography from post-colonial perspective by Nesrin Slaoui and Kautar Archi, and last but not least, the burgeoning of secondary literature around these writings, including by sociologists themselves. Obviously, autosociobiography, on which I will focus my talk, present in today's literary field all defining features of an institutionalization in the making. Bourdieu's children belong to distinct birth cohorts, though. Annie Ernaux speaks frequently of the violent shock, as she puts it, that reading Bourdieu in the 70s was for her. The back cover of Didier Héribon's Retour à Reims gives a quote by Annie Ernaux. The title of the second chapter of Édouard Louis' Changer Méthode is Didier, for Didier Héribon, and Nesrin Slaoui declares the books by Édouard Louis, Didier Héribon, and Annie Ernaux have inspired me. Not to mention here the proliferation of the genre outside of France, especially in Germany, where Daniela Drecher, for instance, or Christian Baron align themselves with Bourdieu and Héribon and Ernaux and Louis. Defining themselves through what we could call a rhizomatic constellation of elective affinities, hence marked by a tendency to isomorphism, as well as counterbalancing differentiation, autosociobiographical practices are embedded in a cumulative history, which characterizes the relational structure of the cultural field. In other words, Bourdieu himself circulates, following the very pattern he identifies in his famous article on la circulation internationale des idées. His ideas do travel from one field of production, sociology, to another one, literature, involving a series of social operations, which include processes of legitimation, of course, but also of denigration. By typical effects of allodoxia, writes Bourdieu in a paragraph that interestingly got cut in the English version of the article, such transfers, I quote in French then, fournissent des ressources inépuisables aux condamnations de mauvaise foi dans lesquelles excellent les essayistes médiocres et irresponsables, tels que les inventeurs du mythe de la pensée 68 ou les dénonciateurs vertueux du cynisme. We recognize like the usual polemical tone of Bourdieu here. So were proof needed? It should suffice here to quote Frédéric Becbédé on Édouard Louis in The Figaro, c'est Germinal réécrit par Calimero. Or, le point on Annie Ernaux. Annie Ernaux n'écrit pas, elle crache, elle rue, elle vomit. Or, the 2021 editorial elegantly titled Peut-on décemment en avoir plein le cul des récits de transfuges? That was published in the web magazine Frustration, that is actually a left-wing anti-capitalistic magazine. So interestingly speaking. So these vitriolic attacks reveal what's at stake in the success of autosociobiography, the legitimate definition of the value of the literary field's capital. Without the slightest indulgence, obviously for these critics, one might still deem such a literary success paradoxical, an effect of the work of a social scientist who demonstrated a relentless concern with unveiling the magic of rights of institution, as well as the risk of routinisation, normalization, and usure, wearing out, inherent to literary consecration. Bourdieu indeed maintained a fraught relationship with literature, blaming fiction for being one of the major sites of denial of social structure. La sociologie et la littérature ne font pas bon ménage. Sociology and literature do not get along well, were the opening words of a talk he gave in 1992. And significantly enough, the 2010 volume on Bourdieu et la littérature opened with a preface by the editor, Jean-Pierre Martin, titled Bourdieu, le désenchanteur. Not surprisingly then, Bourdieu's literary heirs positions their work in opposition to literature understood as fiction, narrative, and style. Louis, what I write doesn't meet the demands of literature. Ernaud, naturally no narrative, which would produce a reality rather than searching for it. Kautararchi, let's make a non-literary literature. All of them reclaim the field, the literary field, through renewed forms of self-narration that rely on a transitive relation to the world. Louis champions what he calls the hyper-explicit against the implicit. Ernaud defines her flat writing as the opposite of stylistic jubilation. Archie aims to write in a straight line to resist the cult, she says, of arabesque line. It is hence as much an anti-literature as the invention of new mode of literary expression, as Bourdieu puts it in L'illusion bibliographique. Through heterodox writing, autosocioanalysis become repository for what has long been minorized in the literary and sociological fields alike. That is to say, the body. As Bourdieu describes it in Méditation pascalienne, the body faced, I quote, with the risk of emotion, wound, suffering, and sometimes even death in the social world. Departing from Marxist theory, Bourdieu's sociology of practice indeed places a new emphasis on what he calls les maillots de corps de la classe ouvrière, the undershirts of the working class men, i.e. the most subtle, unseen, intimate aspects of the day-to-day embodied experience of social domination. The way in which, as Eribon puts it, I quote, you experience in your very flesh the sense of belonging to the working class. Bourdieu's theory of habitus as incorporation entails a granular attention to the micro details of the body's language. Social and cultural inequality, Ernaud writes, is reflected in the way we examine the contents of our shopping trolley in a supermarket, or in the words we use to order a cut of beef. Such attention to the ordinary, to the infraordinary, is a ground for a literature that engages the reader, as Ernaud says. Engages the reader, what does it mean? Recognizing their own experience in the writer's wants through what Bourdieu calls sympraxis, at the end of the esquisse. The readers are made sensible to dimensions of the social world they were not aware of. Literature then can become a catalyst for change, a catalyst for potential awakening, a means, as Eribon puts it, I quote, to break with incorporated categories of perception and produce new modes of political perception of reality, end of quote. So, Bourdieu's paradoxical literary fertility now appears less paradoxical. His sociology can be read, I argue, as a reservoir for a form, the factual, a content, the ordinary, and a praxis of literature. Bourdieu's sociology contains virtualities for a literature of lived and embodied experience, of non-singular specificity, and of sociological reimagination, thus allowing the genre of autobiography to be reinvested by the downtrodden. To say it with his own terms, Bourdieu contributed to extend the space of possibilities of the literary field. And the formula does work. Many as are the readers, whether amateur or scholars, who describe in paroxysmic terms how they have been affected, shocked, touched by their reading of autosociobiographies. I will just give like 2 quotes without referencing them, but when I first read this book, I found myself sucked into its pages, besieged by flashbacks of my own childhood or someone else. I was overwhelmed by her book. I felt I was reading the story of my life, etc. That being said, Ernaud writes, I have no idea how my books work. Comment mes livres agissent? By what means is literature efficient? By what means literature agit? What does literary form do to engage its readers that sociological writing might not do? And I'd like to push past the paradox further and suggest that while it's commonly said that Bourdieu has nothing to say about style, we might actually find the answer to this question of writing in his work itself. In the Esquisse pour une auto-analyse, Bourdieu comments on his 1972 book-long piece about Béarn, Célibat et conditions paysannes. He notes, I quote, that the text itself bears hardly any trace of the emotional atmosphere of the inquiry. Mirroring the anamnesis of his past habitus that the return to his childhood region generates, I quote, the return to my origins was accompanied by a return of the repressed. The return to his earlier work is accompanied by a return of the repressed emotions. The next page indeed mentions both the tenderness and the pain he felt while interviewing the people he was bound to and has distanced himself from. These emotions, he says, got contained by objectivist restraint, a reserve due to the fact that he didn't want to betray his people, he says, but also, one might hear, to the fact, as he writes in many instances in the Esquisse, that he cannot say what he felt. Je ne saurais dire comment j'ai ressenti. C'est une expression that's a phrase that we find in many instances in the Esquisse. So this confessed acknowledgement of a missing emotional dimension in his writing actually resonates with the conclusion of La misère du monde. By the virtue of the by the virtue of the exemplification and concretization which they effect, and which at times gives them dramatic intensity, an emotional force close to those of a literary text, the transcribed interviews can have the effect of a revelation, especially for those who share some general characteristics with the speaker. Being able to touch and move the reader, they can produce the shifts in thinking and seeing that are often the precondition of comprehension. So such emphasis here on the emotional force as a means for revelation, and there is like the whole paragraph is really pervaded by a sort of like a mystical relationship to the text. But so emphasis on this emotional force as a means for revelation and the steps towards understanding seems to mark a sort of a turning point for Bourdieu, who constantly distanced himself from empathy and favored a model of a sentimental and impersonal writing, le jeu impersonnel. Rare enough to be mentioned, in a conversation he had with French critic Pierre-Marc de Biasy the same year, Bourdieu brings up the idea of a kinship between sociology and style. A passage that, interestingly, again, he cut for the published version in Le Monde. Il y a cet effort de travail de la langue au centre de mes préoccupations. So there is like this effort of working on the language at the center of my concerns. La plupart du temps, la langue de la sociologie doit rendre raison des réalités vulgaires du monde social, tout en devenant capable d'évoquer, de construire des représentations. C'est-à-dire tout en développant un certain style. Complementing sociological writing, whose aim is to rendre raison, the style is what bears trace of the emotional atmosphere, of the tenderness and the pain of the inquiry, and thus creates an emotional force that engages the reader and has the effect of a revelation. And guess what? It's actually in literary works that sociologists may find a model for such style. At odds with the antagonistic quote I gave earlier, la sociologie et la littérature ne font pas bon ménage, Bourdieu writes in his réponse, I believe that literature is on many points more advanced than social science and contains a whole trove of fundamental problems that sociologists should subject to critical examination instead of ostentatiously distancing themselves from forms of expression and thinking that they deem compromising. As an obedient Bourdieu's child, I would now like to subject to critical examination. Well, we'll see how much time we have. Maybe brief excerpts from 2, maybe 3 auto-sociobiographies written by other Bourdieu's children. First excerpts from Changer Méthode, a Change a Novel, which is a chronicle of Édouard Louis' upward journey from the poor working class of its upbringing to the intellectual scene of Paris, where he becomes a very famous writer. So the following scene recounts an exchange between Édouard and his mother, right after he became close friend with Elena, a girl from the bourgeoisie, and started his social transformation. So I'm going to read it in French, but you have like the English translation on the slide. Un soir, à la fin du repas, j'avais dit à ma mère, je vais boire le thé, tu en veux un? Je n'avais pas dit boire du thé, mais boire le thé, comme Elena. Je l'avais fait pour montrer la nouvelle personne que je croyais être. Ma mère m'a regardée et elle a ri. Attention, il joue au monsieur, celui-là, maintenant. Il est noble, il boit le thé. Elle avait fait semblant de rire, mais j'avais vu la blessure dans sa voix et sur son visage. Toi, tu ne disais rien. Tu regardais la télévision en silence, comme toujours, et je ne sais pas ce que tu pensais de ma transformation. While his father remains an enigma, je ne sais pas ce que tu pensais. The son reads like an open book his mother's face. Elle faisait mine, mais j'ai vu la blessure. Symbolic domination is an affective violence. The wound of shame is all the more heartbreaking here as it occurs in the family circle, fracturing that same intimacy between the mother and the son that makes the immediate deciphering of the face possible. The face-to-face of a long incorporated habitus, the working class mother hiding her shame, and an habitus in the making, the son performing the bourgeoisie language, evokes the affective cost of social mobility in a scene that functions as an X-ray of symbolic violence. Louis remains elliptic, though. As a reader, we are left to suppose what the affective cost might have been on the part of the son when he saw the wound that he had himself inflicted to his mother. If his early trajectory has taken him out of his working class habitus, It's unclear here whether this trajectory has also taken him out of his structures of feeling. Second example, Laplace by Anne Ernaux. So Laplace offers an overview, to say it briefly, of Ernaux's complex relationship with her father. Bavard au café, en famille, devant les gens qui parlaient bien, il se taisait. Ou il s'arrêtait au milieu d'une phrase disant « n'est-ce pas ?» ou simplement « pas », avec un geste de la main pour inviter la personne à poursuivre à sa place. Toujours parler avec précaution, peur indicible du mot de travers, d'aussi mauvais effet que de lâcher un P. Puisque la maîtresse me reprenait, plus tard, j'ai voulu reprendre mon père, lui annoncer que ce parterré ou quart moins d'11 heures n'existait pas. Il est entré dans une violente colère. Je pleurais, il était malheureux. Tout ce qui touche au langage est dans mon souvenir motif de rancœur et de chicane douloureuse, bien plus que l'argent. Se taire, s'arrêter, parler avec précaution. Again, following Bourdieu's teachings, the habitus here imposes a set of limitations that are more felt than known, and which Ernaux crystallizes in the piercing phrase, an unspeakable fear. Une peur, qu'est-ce qu'elle dit? Une peur indicible. Interestingly, linking habitus to a paroxysmal affect that will later, in the second part of the scene, unfurl as anger. The opposite of the hushed interaction between Louis and his mother, the emerging social gap between the daughter and the father turns here into a scene of emotional outburst. Je pleurais, il était malheureux. And then there is a sort of a splitting effect within the writing when the present I taking over to point out the precedence of the pain generated by symbolic violence over economic anxiety. And I will just read like a third excerpt before I conclude. I will not comment on it. I'll let you, because I am saying I'm aware of the time. So this is from Nesrin Slawi's Illégitime that was published in 2021, and that's a book that evokes the challenges Slawi faced during her social journey as a North African woman from a working class family. Quand j'étais plus jeune et que j'accompagnais ma mère au travail, je ne pouvais pas m'empêcher de ressentir du dégoût. Je souffrais de la voir essuyer la crasse des autres. Je souffrais du sentiment d'infériorité que lui infligeaient ses patrons parce qu'ils usaient son corps pour protéger le leur. Elle n'a jamais rien voulu entendre de ces histoires de domination. Elle est toujours restée digne, toujours restée parfaitement maquillée et coiffée. Voilà une femme avenante, blonde, au teint clair, dont les origines étrangères ne transparaissent pas. De quelle domination lui parlait-on? Son métier lui plaisait. J'avais pourtant mal à la voir à la tâche. Peut-être pressentais-je que son corps finirait par lâcher. Well, I'm going to say still two comments on that passage, because first thing, we see that for Slawi's mother, relational forms of recognition erase the humiliation of social exploitation. And so does it mean here that passing is the habitus of first-generation migrants? Or does it mean that sociological analysis misses something? Son travail lui plaisait, so her pleasure, by confining the dominated to either the position of the victim or that of complicity. And second thing is that in this passage, we have a conversion of the daughter's disgust at the beginning into a foreboding. Je pressentais que son corps finirait par la lâcher. A foreboding that will soon become true suggesting that for the dispossessed, no matter what room of symbolic maneuver there is for them, inequalities always remain a question of the sacrifice of the body, of their own life, of life and death. So I conclude. All these excerpts present what Didier Ribon calls social scenes of interpellation, the scènes sociales d'interpellation, in which not only does the affective atmosphere hold significant sociological planetary potential, but this affective atmosphere is also key in engaging the reader, and by doing so, it gives importance, value, weight, Alain Viala would say interest, to the lived experience of the working class. J'importe dans la littérature quelque chose de dur, de lourd, de violent même. That's Annie Ernaux speaking. I import in literature something hard, heavy, violent. It seems that conversely, autosociobiographers import something hard, heavy, violent in sociology. Their texts deepen and amplify the physicality and affective effects of social domination and symbolic violence, intensifying the emotional force of the reader's experience. They do not open up a field per se. And actually, I should have shown that here, Bourdieu is not the only factor explaining the current blossoming of the genre, but that's another talk. So they do not open a new field per se, but they do open a new field of interests, I would say, for both sociology and literature. Style could thus be defined as the writing of a third type, as per Bourdieu's expression, writing of a third type that proceeds from the adequate dosage between the affective and the explanatory. And we could even argue that his literary children provide Bourdieu with solutions to the three problems he encountered: how to respond to what he calls the subjective and objective problem of writing, how to avoid the risk of absorbing the phenomenological within the macrostructure, and how to render the obscure dialectic between agents and structures that defines the social conditions of practice. So I end by saying that I'm now curious to see what prismatic effect such literature might have in the shaping of both sociological and literary fields in the next few years, given that, as Edouard Louis said about autosociobiography during his residency at NYU earlier this month, this is just a beginning. Nous ne sommes qu'au début d'une histoire. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're delighted to have our third speaker, Professor Morgane from Yale, whose Bourdieusian inflected book on both sides of the tracks, social mobility in contemporary French literature, is pretty much hot off the press from University of Chicago Press. The book brings a textual focus to works by transfuge des classes writers, such as Annie Ernaux and Edouard Louis, and many others. And this textual attentiveness also distinguished Morgane's earlier book, Marché au hasard, clinamen et création dans la prose du XXe siècle, which came out in 2019. She's also co-edited the special issue Beaches and Ports for Comparative Literature with Hannah Friedthal, and the volume Lesbian Materialism, The Life and Work of Monique Wittig for Yale French Studies. And she's currently working on a new book on railroads, memory, and patrimony. Her talk today is titled The Bourdieu of the Novel.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for your invitation. So I just published a book to demonstrate that socially mobile writers and characters are the digest of our literary and political moment. These overtrained readers of literary and social science challenge interdisciplinarity and the sociology of literature. how socially to approach texts already filled with sociological comments, and how to keep literary forms in focus while engaging with fields for which social mobility matters a great deal too, such as sociology, politics, and economics. In response, my book offers a new perspective on class mobility as a literary formal question. It's not what does literature tell us about class mobility that the media, the politicians, and the social scientists cannot, but how. The book addresses pressing social issues through forms. Is upward mobility a matter of birth or becoming? How long does one remain mobile? Do social climbers emancipate others in return? Through the conceptual character of the parvenant, we see that one-way success stories of upward mobility have been replaced by multi-directional trajectories of departure, arrival, and return to a point where the idiom of the social ladder has morphed into the metaphor of the train. 19th century types and tropes, such as Balzac's character of Rastignac, have returned in the 21st century, but with a major difference. No longer ventriloquized by bourgeois narrators, cross-class protagonists have leaped off the page to write their own stories. As a result, we now have to turn to nonfiction and autobiographies to read successful plots of upward mobility. Christine Angot, Marie Scondé, Didier Ribon, Annie Ernaux, Kautar Archi, Édouard Louis, Abdelataya. Conversely, contemporary novels have swept the parvenu for the Picaro and are now depicting social immobility, precarity, and downgrading. Julia Deck, Virginie Despentes, Michel Houellebecq, Marine Diaye. My book tracks the causes and explores the consequences of this new partition, which reinforces the rarity of social emancipation. In my conclusion, I show that the Bildungsroman has morphed into a specific form of apprenticeship novel recounting how one becomes an artist, the Künstlerroman. I put to the forefront a corpus of younger, lesser-known contemporary authors who have published updated rewrites of canonical 19th century novels, Flaubert's especially, by demoting the plot of social mobility. If literature is an important tool to change class, in return, stories of social mobility are a structuring force in the literary field, helping us understand the partition and social potency of genres. The novel is no longer sufficient to capture the tension at the core of class mobility. To fully understand socially mobile writers, we must look at their fiction, nonfiction, interviews, and articles side by side so as to embrace their contradiction. Contemporary French authors climbed the ladder through literature, revitalizing the classics in and out of school. And if the canon does suffer a certain depreciation today, it is within the very realm of French literature. What is demoted is not the value of classics, but the novel form itself, which no longer portrays successful social climbers, but stagnant, demoted protagonists. In their recent book, Trahir et Venger, Laëlia Véron and Karina Biven even replace cultural capital by phantasmatic capital, that is, artists, journalists, and politicians inventing themselves popular origins and capitalizing on them, since narratives of class mobility are now in fashion. A word on my book's neologism, parvenant. By choosing a word without class in it, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that class is not apprehended alone, severed from other embodied subjectivity. Parvenant also points to the main direction of narratives of social mobility, upward, while indicating that people experiencing class mobility keep on arriving. The word captures the disorientation of social mobility, like the oxymoronic phrases downgraded upwards by Bourdieu or immigrant from the inside by Ernaux. A parvenant flees but never fully arrives, living on both sides of the tracks, feeling, quote, this slightly dizzy sense of still being on the ladder, identified by Richard Hoggart. With Parvenant, we come back to the literary framework of social issues, transforming the past participle parvenu into a present participle underscores temporality and thus stylistic choices, rhetorical details, literary forms. And my book builds a poetics of class mobility around this figure. The writers of my corpus are deeply influenced by Bourdieu. Ernaux makes explicit strategic use of his sociological insights and concepts. Like him, she defines herself as a transfuge, child of a transfuge, a narrator of social mobility. She acknowledges a distancing effect by describing, quote, the feeling of unreality that transfuge feel when they study and start their acculturation process. Readers face a similar detachment in Bourdieu's social and intellectual autobiography, Sketch for Self-Analysis. The book opens with the epigraph, "This is not an autobiography," yet the sentence is not borrowed from another author, but signed by Bourdieu himself, which is very uncommon and suggests a great internal split. Ernaud also shares with Bourdieu, quote, "the desire to append literary and social hierarchies by writing the same way about topics considered unworthy of literature, supermarket, commuter rail, abortion, and about other more noble topics such as the workings of memory, the sensation of time passing, and by associating them." Likewise, Bourdieu invests great theoretical ambition into humble and empirical objects that often seem trivial at first glance. And it brings us back to what Gisèle Sapiro was saying yesterday about ambiguity. My book is not written, though, with the Bourdieusian framework. References to him are scattered. I may refer to his imagery of the métro, the subway, to describe the network of someone's life. I refer to his remarks on Flaubert's reported speech as a tool to offer an exhaustive representation of the social field. He also made multiple references to Balzac, his characters, and his statue. I mostly think with Bourdieu when I ask what happens to the body of those who change their social milieu. If the body is a social product, it does not mean one can easily control it. In her contribution to a volume on Bourdieu, Ernaud relies on La Distinction to formulate the bodily consequences of her mobility. Quote, "Turmoil, unease, awareness appear when there is a dissonance between the habitus and the field, when, for example, bourgeois city dwellers find themselves at the table of peasants, or a student from a working class background is by chance invited to a bourgeois soirée. The split habitus generates a vague and hard to locate feeling of physical discomfort. And Ernaud considers that those feelings are the preuve par corps, the bodily proof of the accuracy of Bourdieu's theory. Bourdieu himself experienced, quote, "a terrible unease tied more to a feeling of blunder than of transgression when he gave his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France." So what I show in the book is that on the one hand, writers and characters experiencing social demotion, especially the May 68 intellectuals who went to work in factories, for instance, describe at length how difficult it was to attune their muscles to the pace of an assembly line. But on the other hand, the bodily apprenticeship of upwardly mobile characters is often problematic, deflected, or absent, not in their articles, but in their literature. I theorized what I call the trance of the trance class, a certain unrest and unease, a malaise or a nausea, when describing the reconfiguration of voices, gestures, and postures induced by upward trajectories. What's crucial for my book is the fact that post-World War II social mobility and the figure of the parvenu have further brought literature and sociology together. Many landmark sociologists and cultural theorists are upwardly mobile: Bourdieu, Hargert, Stedman, Williams, and the leading literary voices of class mobility have been deeply influenced by Bourdieu, to such an extent that there is an Annie Ernaux entry in the 2020 Dictionnaire International, Bourdieu, edited by Gisèle Sapiro. 2 years before the culturally explosive publication of his first novel on social mobility, Édouard Louis organized a conference on Bourdieu's legacy with talks by Ernaud and Héribon, among others. Louis and Héribon's social introspections have even been translated into English by a Bourdieusian scholar specializing in Balzac and Proust, Michael Lucy. I would say that Bourdieu's death in 2002 and the posthumous publication of his intellectual Bildungsroman in 2004 are largely responsible for the renewed interest in social mobility at the turn of the 21st century, as well as for the now inextricable intertwining of autobiographical literature and sociology. Yet, I also believe that the figure of the parvenu can be a thorn in the sociology of literature's side. In For Sociology of the Novel, Lucien Goldman argues that the real subject of cultural creation are social groups and not isolated individuals. Can we consider that social climbers belong to a social group? And if so, to which one? And can we bring back to context those who strive to decontextualize themselves? Critics of contemporary literature tend to delegate their critical voice to writers when they discuss sociological content, relying on their user's manual and their qualitative insights. Conversely, critics critics of 19th century literature write convincing sociological studies on texts published before sociology became a fully constituted and institutionalized field of study. In The Misfit of the Family, Lucy unearths how there is something in the imaginative form of Balzac's novels that is sociological. Frédérique Giraud, in her book on Zola, shows how the writer's biography is mirrored in the multi-directional social mobility of his numerous characters. Hannah Fritzl, in Spoiled Distinction, excavates from Marcel Proust a mode of too close reading that does away with distinction, prestige, and social hierarchy. But Balzac, Proust, and Zola had not read Bourdieu. What if novels and narratives were constantly interspersed with sociological stage directions? What if authors were practicing a permanent participant observation of the social field and of their own place within it? Can a Bourdieusian infused criticism be as revealing if its main object of study is already Bourdieusian infused too? Or as a reader of Ernaud once wrote in her private correspondence with the author, is she simply the Bourdieu of the novel, Bourdieu en roman? Bourdieusian sociologist Éric Fassin is well aware of this pitfall. In Le Sexe politique, he bypasses the author's sociological awareness by focusing on the tacit pact between writer and reader. Similarly, philosopher Martine Lebovici, in her research on Richard Wright, Assia Djebar, and Albert Memmi as class renegades, opts for the autobiographical pact. However pertinent and generative, this focus on pacts ends up sidelining the text's details and form. In Ce qu'ils vivent, ce qu'ils écrivent, an edited volume that includes many chapters on class mobility, Bernard Lahire virulently describes a literary critic's attention to textuality and form as a self-serving corporatism aimed at promoting their fields of study at the detriment of literature's reality and content. For him, the literariness of text can well do with that textuality and form. In the preface to the French translation of Hogarth's The Uses of Literacy, Passeron tones down literary devices to praise instead the author's strictly sociological undertaking. Paul Pasquali, in Passer les frontières sociales, argues that literary writers are not the best sources for understanding class mobility. Their texts are too caricatural, inconveniently retrospective, and filtered by literary creativity. To avoid this caveat, Pasquali examines the cover letters written by underprivileged scholars who applied to the French Grandes Écoles. On the one hand, sociology does challenge literature because it no longer solely relies on quantitative research, but also on narratives and interviews on, quote, the biographical approach of life stories. Sociologist Jules Naudet, who's a specialist of social mobility in France, India, and the US, champions the transition from data to discourse when it comes to capturing the ambivalence and the multiplicity of the effects caused by upward social mobility. French writer of rurality, Pierre Bergogneau, once wrote that it's in the absence of sociology that the 19th century novelist was able to believe himself omniscient. In the 21st century, we could transpose this analysis and say that in the presence of sociology, the 21st century novelist has lost his omniscience. On the other hand, in sociology, as in cultural studies, forms, when addressed, can lose their literariness to become reflections, relays, transpositions, or mediation of social content. It's the case for Jameson in The Political Unconscious, quote, what must now be stressed is that at this level, form is apprehended as content. According to Bourdieu's theory of the field, the emphasis should not be on textuality either, but on words as conductive bodies and mediums of the social world. A text reflects the author's position in the field. A novel is a choice between available social postures and literary practices. Even Alain Viala, a fervent advocate of sociopoetic, joins in this theory of mediation. Quote, a sociology of content, like for example that of Goldman, renders style of secondary importance. A more consequential sociology, using the concept of habitus, can at least attempt a mediation between an acquired social characteristic and a way of writing, end of quote. In my book, we immerse ourselves in diction, following in Barthes's much commented maxim, a little bit of formalism takes us away from history, but a lot brings us back to it. In Realizing Capital, what Anna Kornbluth calls her social close reading, and financial formalism originate in her object of study, capitalism and its own fictitiousness. She underlines the historically specific fact that for the Victorians, capital was no simple referent amenable to mimetic index. The rendering of capital in realism therefore entails less reference and more aesthetization. End of quote. From capital to class, my methodology adapts to the formal logic of social mobility today. My attention to form is not, or not only, the fruit of a critical preference, it stems from my very object of study, the contemporary parvenu. Mediation, I would argue, is not necessary when it comes to social climbing because the parvenu's world is already literary, the way capital in Kornbluth's analysis is fictitious. The epigraph from Ernaud that I chose for my book points in this direction. I realize that I am always searching for the signs of literature in reality. The social climber's eye and insight are immediately tied to textuality. I derive my reading method from her formal and bookwormy inclination, and I aim to show that a socially conscious reading of form is capable of going beyond what authors explicitly formulate, beyond their biographical experience and social expertise, so as to avoid relying on summary, paraphrase, contextualization, or on the author's own meta-comments. And I would say, for instance, that Sylvaine, you just mentioned Kauta Harshi, who says she writes in a straight line, but she actually does write in arabesque. So it's interesting that she frames her writing in a way that a literary critic would disagree with. My chapters put forward Barthes's objection to Goldman's sociology of literature. Quote, "The level at which Goldman positioned himself is essentially ideological. What happens in this macro critique to the verbal surface of the work? Goldman's form, singular, paradoxically seems to bypass forms in the plural." End of quote by Barthes. By poetics and formalism, I certainly do not mean to sever stylistics or literature from social inputs. Neither do I solely focus on plot, genre, and macro elements such as the figure of the narrator. For such perspective, let's isolated details and telling macro elements fall by the wayside. Instead, I ask, how can a verb tense capture a cross-class romance? Why do journalists name drop literary characters in their articles on social mobility? What does the motif of the door tell us about rites of passages from one class to another? How is an abundant use of italics indicative of a writer's view on the working class? Why should we care about the social ladder as a metaphor? Although Ernaud adheres to Bourdieu's sociology, the reverse is quite debatable. He would not have appreciated her apology for literature. In the rules of art, readers have to go through 4 quotes before hearing the sociologist's voice, 3 epigraphs by Raymond Queneau and Flaubert. Then the preface starts with the 4th quote, whose author is not announced. So for clarity, here is the quote that Bourdieu does not give an author to except in a footnote, and then his own voice. So the paragraph starts like that. Will we allow the social sciences to reduce the literary experience, the most elevated experience we can have, along with love, to surveys about our leisure activities when literature is about the meaning of our lives? End of quote. And then Bourdieu starts, such a sentence taken from one of the countless, timeless, and authorless appeals in favor of reading and of culture would have without fail unleashed the furious elation that the narrow-minded commonplaces inspired in Flaubert. And it goes on again to critique that quote and to quote again the same person in red. The author whose quotes are mocked is only mentioned in a footnote, Danielle Salnave, Le Don des Morts. Bourdieu does not mention, or maybe he does not know, that she is, like him, socially mobile. While the quote is allegedly timeless and nameless, it is neither genderless nor classless. What Bourdieu considers a commonplace, and it is a commonplace, the cliched apology of reading and education, was also Salnave and Ernaud's tool to change social classes. Now that my book is published, I could envision 2 different forms of coda to it. One coda would be on adoption. Studying Amandine Gay's essay Une poupée en chocolat, along with David Chou's film Retour à Séoul, which brings to mind the title of Didier Ribon's Retour à Reims, or Ernaud Retour à Yvetot, enabled me to envision adoption as a form of forced migration and class mobility, complicating the origin of social affiliations, especially as the adopted, like the parvenants, are always brought back to their status as children. A second coda would be on the ecology of class mobility. In his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Rob Nixon unearthed the genre of the environmental picaresque, penned by writer-activists in which characters of outcasts are confronted with long-term pollution. In a recent lecture at Yale, he quoted a passage from Caroline Steedman's Landscape for a Good Woman, a scene in which her father picked flowers, bluebells, up a hill, but was scolded by a forest keeper in Tweed for his lack of manner and knowledge about nature and the fact of not picking up flowers. Nixon apprehends Steedman's landscape as a jointly social and environmental relationship to the world. I'm tempted to outline the contours of an environmental Bildungsroman. There's a corpus of texts, not on those who leave, but on those who stay behind, notably in rural settings. Such parvenus leave a mark in the landscape of their childhood, revealing an environmental backdrop to social mobility, turning emancipation into an ecosystem. The hollow of a tree in Marie-Hélène Lafon's Les Pays, and the forest ghosts, les fantômes sylvestres, in Marwan Bakhti's Comment sortir du monde. Both spaces encapsulate, quote, the gap opened by the departure for cities. This imagery of countryside halls resonates with Abdelmalek Sayad's sociology of immigration, his science of the double absence, with which he captures the dangling position of emigrant, missing in both countries. Bourdieu could prove useful an interlocutor here, not only because field is as environmentally polysemic as landscape, but also because of his ethnographic research in Kabylia and Béarn. A critic calls it a sociology of dispossession, landless peasant, worker without work, deculturated, dispossessed. Bourdieu focused on those who stay behind too, Algerian workers or French peasants at village dances, what he calls impeasanted peasants, their habitus no longer attuned to the potential partners drawn to city life. But Bourdieu also absents himself, hollowing out the landscape of his childhood when he left for the city and hollowing out the landscape of his childhood when he came back to do research. I quote him. The point of departure of this research is a very personal experience that I recounted in the article, but in a veiled form, because at the time I felt compelled to disappear. Thank you.
So last but not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Tristan Leperlier. He's a research fellow at the CNRS and a visiting faculty member at Columbia, who has been teaching courses on the sociology of literature. His research focuses on the internationalization and US reception of North African literatures in Arabic, French, and Tamazight. And together with Gisèle Sapiro, he is conducting an international survey on the role and impact of literary agents. His talk underscores how language politics inform definition of literary champ, and it's titled Plurilingual Literary Fields in Transnational Context.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you to the organizer. So I'm sorry, there is some technical issues. I'm going to work on two computers. I hope it's not going to be too much of an issue. And sorry if I stutter a bit because of these problems. So my presentation today, a plurilingual literary field in a transnational context. I will try to explore the power relations between literary languages locally and in circulation. So I'm going to try to span the research I've been doing during my PhD up until the research I'm currently doing. So first, I'm going to explore what we can call plurilingual literary fields and then observe them in translation. So the field theory as conceptualized by Bourdieu was based on the French case, which provided a sort of a model that was very reductive compared to Bourdieu's ambitions. So many researchers have agreed on the need to overcome the so-called mythological nationalism. And what I'm going to argue today is the need of also overcome the mythological monolingualism. The Swiss writer Peter von Matt says that Swiss writers belong to two different spaces of existence, national and political, the other one linguistic and literary. So we can argue that the literary fields are typically situated at the crossroad of national boundaries and linguistic areas. Linguistic areas, they can be either very much centralized and hierarchized, like the Francophone linguistic area, or more polycentric and less hierarchized, like the Arabophone linguistic area or even the Anglophone one. The power relations in the field between literary languages depend on the language planning, so the linguistic policies implemented by the state towards assimilation, monolingualism, like in France and Russia, or at the other end of the spectrum, federalization, like in Canada or Belgium. It also depends on the specific power relations between languages in the World Republic of Letter. When we talk about literary fields, usually we assume that the language issue is marginal. In reality, what I'm arguing is that we reinforce, by misrecognizing it, the symbolic domination of a single language over others. For the French case, the Breton literature, the Creole literatures are not taken into account into the French literary field. So in a monolingual literary field, language sometimes does play a role. For example, when the Occitan poet Frédéric Mistral was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1904, it was a paradoxical occasion for the French literary field to reaffirm that French is the language, that the only language that could be written in the French literature. Was it? Does it make sense what I've just said? I'm sorry, it was lots of arabesques. Plurilingual literary fields and spaces, in them, the language is a major issue. The question is which language is legitimate to write the nation. In the case of Algeria, the literary field is divided into two subfields, the Arabophone subfield and the Francophone subfield, that are strongly institutionalized with publishing houses, journals, university departments, etc. This institutionalization of linguistic diversity can go so far as to go to federalization, like in Canada, where subfields became fields. Monolingual Anglophone literary field on the one hand, and the bilingual literary field in Quebec. So the Canadian, we cannot speak of a Canadian literary field anymore, but of a Canadian literary space, a plurilingual literary space that is an object of secondary investment by the Canadian writers. So depending on the language policy of their state, the most autonomous writers react differently. The French Canadians writers in the 50s and 60s rejected translation, literary exchanges with their Anglophone colleagues, which was something promoted by the federal state, in favor of building an independent Quebecois literary field. While conversely, in Algeria, well, in the 80s, where the state policy was trying to implement, there was a way to implement a linguistic policy called Arabization, so an assimilation policy. In this case, the most autonomous writers of both subfield, Arabophone and Francophone, sought to enhance literary exchanges and translation. But it changes in the 1990s. Tahar Jaoud and Tahar Wattar, who were the symbols of this autonomous circulation between both subfields of the Algerian literary field, became the very symbols of what was called the war between languages in Algeria during the civil war of the 90s. So in my book, I've analyzed the political commitments of the Algerian writers during the civil war. And one of the issues at stake was to what extent was the civil war a war between languages in the literary field. What I argue is that the linguistic divide is not what structures the literary field. What structures the literary field is its transnationality. The fact that it is structured by the opposition of a national pole and an international pole. You can see here on this representation of the field based on the multiple correspondence analysis. So the linguistic divide, I mean, the structuring of the field is transnational in the sense that poles are national and international, but language plays a role as subfields, Arabophone and Francophone. So the transnational structuring of the field has also explanatory virtue. It is what explains the most why writers took this political stance or the other, pro-Islamist, anti-Islamist. However, the Civil War had an effect of making the literary field less autonomous. It made it lose some of its autonomy. In this context, the literary competition was reframed as a competition between languages. How so? I argue that it is the consequence of the synchronization of intellectual fields with the political field. The language issue is nowhere central in the intellectual fields, but everywhere secondary. So language became the main common ground between all these fields. So that's how I argue that the civil war in Algeria became partly a war between languages. So apart from being completely opposed, the two subfields form a continuum, as you can see here on this graph about Algerian publishing houses. Despite this continuum, there are strong inequalities between both languages. Arabic had a strong state support, while French had more specific prestige. For a long time, until recently, there were more titles and authors publishing in French, and until now, the status of the audience, the flows of translation, and above all, the fact that Francophone writers publish abroad, mainly in France, has a strong impact on the prestige of French over Arabic. So literary field, despite, we can talk about a literary field despite the fact that it is linguistically divided and transnationally structuring. We can see that also through the spontaneous citations of writers. That sort of charts the outline of a literary field beyond the linguistic and the national divide. So for example, the writers publishing, the Francophone writers publishing in Paris, the Hypercenter, will be cited by everyone, writing in French, writing in Arabic, but they will cite just themselves. The writers of the internationalized center would cite the Parisian Hypercenter, but they would not cite the Algiers periphery, etc., etc. So that's why I argue that we can talk about a plurilingual, bilingual literary field and a transnational literary field. So now I'm going to observe how this plurilingual and already transnational literature circulates in translation, so in English in the US. So I don't focus on Algeria anymore, but I have broadened my scope to North African literature, meaning Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. the main result of it is that the circulation of this literature happened to reinforce the tendencies of the original fields, not because of a mere application of the North African issues to what's happening here, but because, of course, of the US context of publication. So first point, the reinforcement of the capitals of the linguistic areas. I saw during in my research on Algeria during the Civil War that 25% of Francophone Algerian published in Paris. But here, as you can see, it's 85% of all translations from French into English that are chosen from texts published in Paris. For Arabic, it was 5% of Arabophone writers who published in Beirut. Here, it's 40% of the translations that were chosen from texts published in Beirut, and mostly in Gallimard, Grasset Le Seuil for France, and Dar al-Adab for Beirut. So the increasing integration of the Maghreb that are peripheries of both linguistic areas, the Arabophone linguistic areas and the Francophone linguistic areas. Their increasing integration into those linguistic areas has a strong impact on the circulations, on the circulation of this literature in translation. So the linguistic area is often I think the missing link, the mediation that is often overlooked, forgotten in the study of linguistic, of literary circulation. Second point is the reinforcement of the domination of the French language. That is almost as a consequence of what I've just shown, because the North African literature, the Francophone North African literature, circulates through the same intermediaries as French literature, same editors, same translators, same literary agents, same subsidies by the French government. And French is the most translated language in the US. Same intermediaries, but not the same mediators. The Francophone literature from North Africa is presented here as Arab, and the French language often disappears from the paratexts of the texts. So they as being labeled as Arab, they also enjoy a certain more attention by publishing houses in the US, as evidenced by the fact that on the list of the French Publishers Agency, 5% of their list is composed of racialized writers from France, while it's 25% of everything they sell to US publishers, a third of them being North African writers. Third point is the reinforcement of the linguistic division. When you, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so this is the French share of languages on the US market. So reinforcement of the linguistic division. So when you look at this this chart, you notice a difference with what I showed you earlier. This continuum in the Algerian literary field between the two subfields. Here, there is no continuum anymore. There's a strong divide between languages, Arabic and French, Arabic being published in university presses, French being published by independent presses, also divided in the university between French studies and Middle East studies. So we cannot say that North African literature exists on the US market. They are either included in the Francophone literature or in the Arabophone literature, the Arabic literature. But Arab literature, not Arabic, but Arab literature is a relevant label on the US market, as I have seen that for recent research on Arab Americans in the US. If we look at Arab literature on the US markets divided between Arabic, French, and English, this makes sense for publisher. I have, for example, a letter by in my archives, a letter by Jackie Kennedy, who was working as an editor at Doubleday, and she said that she refused to publish Tahar Ben Jelloun, the Moroccan francophone writer, because she already had the Arabophone Egyptian Naguib Mahfouz. So was interchangeable. But it's just my point is to say that the Arab literature makes sense for publishers in the US beyond the linguistic divide. It's also evidenced by the fact that publishing houses like Syracuse University Press or Interlink Book publish Arab literature beyond the linguistic divide of Arabic, French, and English. We see here, it's not very visible, but we can see sort of a continuum between publishing houses, especially between French and English, but also a strong opposition between Arabic on the one hand and English on the other hand. My point here is to show that when we look at Arab literature on the US market, Arabic and English are very much opposed. There is sort of a continuum, but there's also very strong opposition and inequality between languages within this Arab literature on the US market. The reinforcement of the linguistic division is also the consequence of different type of translators. So here you have a representation of the three ideal types of translators. So it is based on 24 of interviews that I made, and also on a survey, ongoing survey that I'm doing with a questionnaire about the relationship between translation and politics, and for which I received 260 responses. So it's still ongoing. I'm still coding it. The main features of those ideal types is first the profession. Translators being professors or full-time translators. Their motivation, pedagogical, economic, literary, linguistic. It's a strong opposition between Arabic being translated almost only by professors, by scholars, and the gender opposition. That brings me to the last part of my presentation about the paradoxical reinforcement of the share of the domination of men over women when circulating in the US. There are less women translated in the US compared to their share in the local fields in North Africa. There is even a tendency, as you can see here, in the last 30 years, in favor of men. It's not just because translations deal mostly with classics, actually, so mainly, arguably, men. But the main reason of this inequality between men and women translated is the fact that male translators don't translate women. This is striking. Male translators translate 90% male authors, while women translators translate half-half. What is also very striking is the fact that among the few texts with the female authors that are published, they are selected from a pool of even fewer women. A fourth of all translations by North African women have Leila Abu Zaid, Leila Lalami, or Assia Jabbar as an author. So there is, and same goes for Arab American women that I have studied. There are less Arab women on the US market, but those who manage to slip through the net achieve more visibility and more recognition. It's what Richard so called the Toni Morrison effect. Finally, I don't know how much time I have left. Another 2 minutes.
Everybody's gone over their time.
Okay, so I have my 10 minutes, not 2 minutes. I'm going to very quickly compare the reception of those 3 women writers on Goodreads. 3 of them being read in English, but written originally in different languages. So Year of the Elephant, written originally in Arabic, Fantasia by Asad Jabbar, written originally in French, and Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, written directly in English. My point, I'm going to be quick, but my point is to show that there are strong inequalities between, that the inequalities between gender and language overlap. So if you look at the what is called on Goodreads the bookshelves, so the tags that readers assign to the different novels, you can see like sort of a continuum from the most particular text, The Year of the Elephant, to the more universal Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits. For this novel, what is highlighted is the fact that it is fiction. So the genre, well, is very important in tagging this novel. I mean, it's not a novel, but yes. While the fact that she is a woman and the fact that she writes in English is completely silenced. On the other end of the spectrum, for The Year of the Elephant, the genre is does not appear basically in the tags. What is mostly important for readers is the fact that she is a woman who writes it, and in Arabic. French is in between. It's also related to different types of readings. An ethnographic reading for The Year of the Elephant, and a more universalizing reading for Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits. Here again, French being in between, with a literary reading, despite the very orientalistic, exoticizing cover that you can see for this text. So to conclude, I don't have any conclusion. I hope I have I have shown the benefit of overcoming this methodological monolingualism and the importance of comparing languages locally, but also in translation. Thank you.
Well, how much time do we have for questions? Okay.
How much time we want for lunch?
That's the issue. Well, I do want to give some time to questions. These were such rich presentations. And really, somebody mentioned the word prismatic, maybe it was Sylvaine. It was an incredible prism effect on different ways to approach questions of field, social and cultural capital, the question of formalism, and parvenant. And now this kind of interesting mapping of what comes out in these graphs are these very clear dynamics of power that may be sort of referred to generally, but then suddenly it's like really like a relief map of how things operate. I was wondering there about, raise a question about this Laila Lami's text written directly in English, in a sense bypassing, because the Anglophone market now is becoming more dominant for European and non-European as well still. The paradigm that occurs to me is the one that Rebecca Walkowitz uses of born translated, which pulls born translated. These are works that are marketed as, you know, by others, but they are written directly in English, or they're English ready. They're sort of written with translation in mind. And I don't want to be too cynical about it. It ranges across many different practices, and you can understand writers who really need recognition, to come back to questions of they don't know, they're not in circuitry of knowledge capital. So this becomes a very pragmatic strategy for gaining some kind of place within any literary field. So these are just some of the things that occurred to me listening to all of you, but maybe we could start if there are any questions among you for each other. And let's open it up. Please.
Enjoyed the talks very much. Have lots of questions I wish to ask, but time's short. So really just, it seems as though the panel dramatized the split between literary criticism and the sociology of literature. The first three papers were very literary. They culminated in interpretations of texts that I would say thematized Bourdieu's theories. And then Tristan's talk, which mapped the plurilingual field from translation, was, I may say so, as a literary scholar myself, very sociological, empirical, sketching a map of the field. And so it seems that we've reproduced the division which nominally we wish to overcome, or simply that, disciplines are stronger than wishes. But I've thought, so this really is only a question, is there a way to bridge these methods in the end, or is there really only ever going to be reproducing the disciplinary line, even with Bourdieu, who obviously had these bridging ambitions? I understand.
I would say that listening to my co-panelists, I could see many points of intersection, even with Tristan. I mean, so something that comes to mind is the citation and the circulation. I mean, basically the practice of dropping names or just citing people and thanking them. I mean, all the narratives of class mobility have often been mocked for having 3 or 5 pages of thank you at the end, which is kind of an American practice that's been imported in French. So quoting people in the end, quoting them in the short excerpt of Gatsby, or just circulating their names to go from one place of legitimation to another one. So I would say you could find many different convergences, including the practice of just naming someone else that could either be understood as a social capital or just a practice of legitimation or just positioning oneself in the field. So I was struck by that through line.
I just thought maybe Tristan, you might want to respond because it's.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, not all my work in my presentation also. Sorry. Like close reading is also part of my work. I think there is some circulation between. I'm myself a literary scholar. My position is literature, even if I do sociology of literature, I'm a literary scholar. For example, what I was doing at the end about the reception of those writers is based not on quantitative analysis, but qualitative close reading.
But your close read is the archive of perception.
True, in this case. Yeah, you're right. But it's an interesting thing is that I've felt that I needed to apologize right now. I've said, but I can do literature. That's an interesting.
You have a chapter on Bourdieu's.
Yeah. That's we.
You just have to say that. That's all.
And do you say that Bourdieu thematizes the model that you have demonstrated?
No, not at all. No, this I very much against the theme. I mean, it's not about that. Yeah.
I want to give John
Just a brief comment as the speaker who feels after hearing all of the talks oddest of the three, of the four. I think what I'm hearing is something about the difference of the post-war novel and really more even the contemporary novel from novels that are pre-war and older. And that what we're looking at now is something like this, the sociologization of the novel. And what I'm wondering, and this is more a question than a response, is how to register the difference between that phenomenon and the relation between sociology and the older European novel, which Bourdieu wants to say in the Rules of Art, often anticipates sociology, and that's a problem for him. It's almost as though the novel makes sociology unnecessary if read deeply and insightfully. So I'm wondering, how does one register that the presence of sociology in the novel that's actually innocent of contact with sociology?
Okay, there's a hand here and then in the back and then Giselle.
So thank you very much. It's really fascinating as somebody coming from sociology, the harsh gaze of sociology. So I had a couple of questions. One, I think, for John, and I'm wondering whether you're thinking of what thinking about something like The Great Gatsby and the kind of questions of social capital allows us to think about, perhaps about a specific moment in modernity. And I was thinking about, if you to use kind of Bourdieusian language, kind of the modern fantasy of conversion. That capital, like a modern fantasy of conversion, that capitals can be converted, that if you put enough work, right, enough labor hours, right, Bourdieu kind of plays with that in forms of capital, then these conversions would be possible. And part of the kind of pathetic, tragic moment is the limits of conversions. And so I was wondering both how perhaps you can think about the limits of conversions in relation to Bourdieu, so kind of speaking back to Bourdieu on that level, but also about speaking to kind of historical sociology, about thinking about modalities of thinking of conversion as a way of thinking about historical moments. So let me stop there.
It's a very complicated question. I'm not sure I get the implications, the full implications of it. But what comes to mind is the sort of the converse of what I just said, that there is a way in which sociology has been novelized in contemporary disciplinary practice, or at least a desire for a kind of novelization of sociology is being expressed in Bourdieu and perhaps in other sociologists. I think that's largely European. I think that American sociology is quite different, and maybe that doesn't express that. But the sensitivity of the French novel and French sociology to possibility of conversion, that seems to me conspicuously different from the American disciplinary scene, where the disciplinary walls are much higher, much more policed. And I think it's something that Americans we keep trying to learn, how to do these conversions, but they tend to fall back into their disciplinary cubicles. I think that's as far as I can go at the moment with your question. Very complicated.
Hi. So if anything, I'm just kind of curious, Professor.
Could you speak up a little, because
Of course.
the room rounds
Thank you very much for your conversation. So I was just kind of curious about, what do you think of the relationship between, at least within the American context, the rise of like autofiction, and then in terms of your interpretation, at least, of the difference between the Anglophones' relationship to socialization of narrative versus how it's then, I guess in the contemporary context, the Francophone, I think as you described, the auto-sociological narrative. So I was just kind of curious how it's like both contemporary trends, but then at least in the context of Anglophone, very much autofictional that doesn't, I guess, address these class elements. Like, does that prove your point? At least recognition of, at least in the Anglophone context, the lack of class analysis? that make sense?
Yeah.
Right,
The
Chancellor?
only thing I can say in that department is that I was very struck when Edouard Louis published his first book, that he insisted on subtitling a novel in the US, which is a very peculiar choice, because in the US, if it's slightly autobiographical, I think there was an impulse from the publisher to call that a memoir. So, and he changed his mind. I mean, at first he was really labeling his first two books novels, and then the translation was a novel as well. And then he abandoned, as you very well explained, the novel form, and is more into the narrative or the sort of protest form of the narrative. So I think there's something interesting here that having the novel as a subtitle actually shows that is a foreign text that has not been completely metabolized by the American partition of genre. That's the example I would take. That's a very tiny way to answer the question.
On this question of Anglophone, there's actually something that plays a role, which is that a publisher can be sued if it's called a memoir and it's actually not a memoir. And there's all this fact checking. Was it you that pointed out that in one context, the fact checking is thanked in the
Yeah.
US, and in Louis' case, it's refused. It's like
Yes.
this is some kind of classism to try to
Yes.
check my novel for factuality.
Exactly.
And these, so we are, the context on a very simple level is highly legalistic. People get extremely upset if personal properties that are claimed for narrative somehow have, and it goes back to this discussion of the pacte biographique and what's implied contractually in that pact. And there are different cultures around this. At the same token, I was thinking of the end of La Misère, or many of the scenes in La Misère du Monde, where it's highly narrativized how workers who are unemployed are sitting in their rooms. It's like, these are like mini récits. They read like novels. This would, in American sociology, I'm sure there are examples of this miserabilism, but it passes in French as a kind of poetic license, I think, more easily than it would in this much more positivist American sociology. I mean, I'm saying cliches here, but Giselle.
Just to add to what you just said, which is fascinating, in France, the use of the label roman is very important to get in the literary prizes. So it's a publishing strategy which has to be used somehow. But I think Edouard really claims he wants category of roman, and he has an argument about this, that roman doesn't have to be fiction, and he has a very articulate argument about that. I wanted to say that I really the fantastic panel, and I of course find that there are many connections in the different methodologies used. I just wanted to add something about the success of this novel. Kind of novels or writings today. We have to put it in the perspective of the repression of the social in French literature since the Nouveau Roman. And I'm a defender of the Nouveau Roman. You won't find me attacking the Nouveau Roman. It's important to say that here in the US and also in France today. But there was a very strong repression because of socialist realism, which was identified the communist writing. And in the 80s, there were some writers who would speak about working usine, but in a very experimental way with the voices, and but it was really kind of taboo. And it's important because these authors, and she was despised, she was attacked. I mean, it should be mentioned because I think in France everybody knows that, but here it's not so obvious. And also she was sort of rediscovered abroad thanks to Edouard, because he mentioned the affiliation, because she had been translated in English, but you hadn't heard about her because she was translated by a very small publisher, 7 Stories, and independent publisher, and it's when she was also the fact that she was on the Booker list, nominated on the Booker list, that somehow her name started appearing in this context. But for instance, in Germany, she had been translated also, but she was revived by the success of Edouard Louis. And also Edouard Louis himself, because of his success, was very harshly attacked at the moment. He was attacked for miserabilism about working class, and even there were journalists who want to do inquiries to check, to do the and saying that he was lying about his parents. It was very, very violent. So I wanted to insert this struggle thing in the picture, because it's a field also analysis and the historical perspective of French literature in this context. And just last thing I would like to mention, because of the last discussion, Le Pen's book, The Three Cultures, which is about the competition between sociology and literature at the end of the 19th century, and how the sociologist Durkheim, he has a sentence about the les dilettantes. So he was referring to the literary scholars, but these writers, they claimed they were sociologists. They wanted to be sociologists, and it was the way they also ennobled the novel in the 1830s. It was to say they were speaking of the real world and doing kind of didactic work for the. So it was really a claim, and there is a whole story of the competition between literature and sociology. I've also a little worked on that.
Your reference to the new novel is absolutely crucial, especially about Ernaux's first unpublished book. Is a new novel. I mean, it's called L'Arbre or Du Soleil à 5 heures. I mean, I have not read it, but it's apparently just about a patch of light on the wall described at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So very Robe Grillet.
And she was very nouveau roman, and she said that. And then she read,
But you could find a way also to present the new novel with social terms. I mean, if you think about the death of the novel character, I mean, the death of the Balzac character, if you read Sarraute, you actually realize that it's not a death, but a social demotion. There's
but I agree.
As a social death,
and
not as a death of narratology. So, yeah.
But it's not the fault of the nouveau roman. It was against the socialist realism. So
I have a question. I just wanted to make a point, John. You were talking about sociology before sociology within the novel itself. I love when I get my monthly classic from the New York. I'm struck by the classics list.
Yeah, a little louder.
Yeah, I'm struck by the classics lists that the houses today. Something that is a wonderful thing for me. It's a bit of a break from whatever is new. You can find yourself in the, wonderful, wonderful writing and the close reading. It's all there without the didacticism. So just a word for classics at the same time.
One last question, and then we'll have lunch.
Thank you for all the excellent talks. Just kind of thinking about connections between different talks. I think at the end of the first talk, you mentioned kind of a particular reading of social capital as a foil for like a very strong framework of the mode of social interaction as competition, struggle. I think it's very interesting to think about that in the sense of a reading of the literary field, these children of Bourdieu, and instead of competing with each other and trying to assassinate each other, literary and otherwise in public, it seems like they've actually built some sort of kind of literary coalition, quoting each other, inviting each other to conferences. And I think like it's interesting to think about that is that they're not fighting over the mantle of, the inheritor or the writer of, biosocioanalysis, but they're creating a kind of literary coalition. Just kind of interested in your take maybe on that as like a field analysis. Like, how do we think about cooperation and reading together rather than competition as a mode of, operating in the literary field?
Yeah. Just a very brief comment so people can go have lunch. But, yes, what you're pointing to seems to me kind of bracketing of social capital in favor of cultural capital, because cultural capital is shared. And there's a pleasure in sharing it, transmitting it, working over it. Whereas social capital really is a question of, well, who's the real disciple of Bourdieu? And I'm going to take this other one down, and but if French scholars have overcome this, hooray for them. I think that's a great thing.
Not as simple as that, though, because there is a division between scholars and writers.
Tom,
It's not as simple as that, because there is a division between scholars and writers, and it's a quite
depends,
pronounced.
I know all of them. I don't have a problem with the writer.
Or even between writers, Kautararchi versus Ernaud.
But Kautararchi is a sociologist also. Sociology.
True, but she sort of refuses to say that she's writing a class mobility narrative.
Yeah,
which is interesting as a position.
Yes, yes, of course.
Counter that trio of writers.
May I just one thing, because Charlotte Casigari was showed, I just want to say that the princess, Charlotte Casigari, she is very interested in philosophy and social sciences. She organized it at Monaco, and I was invited there, a kind of panel, regular meetings around philosophy and social sciences, and they have even prizes for nonfiction books, which are in the, and so it's not, the encounter is not so miraculous, because she works with a journalist who had been her professor of philosophy, and he was the one reviewing Bourdieu in Libération for years. And that's it. I just wanted to make a point about Charlotte Casigari.
Again, I'm not sure we do need actually that. I mean,
No, of course you don't. We don't need, but I just wanted.
It's a way of just embracing the Paris Match lens.
No, it was
actually say, oh, but they have good reasons to be together.
No, it was great. No, it was great. But I just wanted to contact, because it's interesting also to nobody knows about her here. So.
But this brings me to my final point, a question for John. You ended on a note that was quite kind to social capital and to these, the knowingness of the social encounter that almost could lead into this cooperism or coalitionism. But I have to say that kind of surprised me, because I felt like you'd set us up for much more critical view of it. Was that a U-turn?
It's not a U-turn, but it certainly is. I was hoping it would be perceived as a dialectical turn, because I think if you take social capital as a concept to use to reduce the social to this raw conflict, then you're denying the way in which we need idealizations of this unequal distribution of something, a form of wealth, that we need idealizations of it, because social life is just constituted by it, and we can't do without it. And it's not always motivated by the desire to exclude, to subordinate. You write a letter of recommendation for a student, and that's a version of the distribution of social capital, and we don't think of that as something that can be simply and utterly reduced to the distribution, an unequal distribution of wealth. We need to idealize it, and when we do, it actually becomes ideal. It actually participates in a certain necessary fantasy that makes social life possible. Does that help?
It does. We'll keep discussing this over lunch, and thank you so much.